All right. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to be doing chapter 16 today, and tomorrow I'm going to do 17 and 18 to try to catch up a little bit with the place that we should be at with the live reading, except that I took last week off. So a quick kind of update on the news there. We've moved into a new apartment. My wife is late in her not late in her third trimester, but she's into her third trimester about halfway. So she hasn't been able to help, and she got sick, so it's been like a tough stretch last week with the humidity and all the stuff that we have to do. So I decided not to do the live readings, but I didn't let people know enough in advance, like I should have, that it was happening. I waited till almost Thursday, I think, before I told the folks. So I'm a little tired. I'm a little wiped out, but I wanted to get back to doing this anyway. So I'm going to read chapter 16. Chapter 16 is a relatively single-minded chapter in that it focuses entirely on Trem and the rest of the group with him. So I'll read that today, and then I'll get 2 knocked out tomorrow. And we'll see how we're doing on Wednesday, if I want to pop another one in there, or if I want to hold off, go Thursday and also Friday. But the goal is to get about 5 chapters read and posted online this week. And that'll kind of catch up a little bit with where we should be at. My goal was to have the entire book available as a live read by the end of the summer, and I think that I'm going to be able to pull that off. There's some other things coming up this summer that are going to maybe bite into some time. I just wanted to apologize for people who have been listening. I know it's tough when you have somebody who doesn't stick to a set schedule. I've been trying to stick to a set schedule. This summer has conspired in every way possible to make that not happen. And there's not a ton that I can do about that except try to play catch up and try to post videos. So everything is now on YouTube for the Sword through chapter 15, including an extra lore chapter on the Napoleon Empire and a little bit about like the process and methods that I use for writing. If anyone's interested in that, it's a separate video. It's labeled as such. It does contain potentially small spoilers, so if you want to avoid certain things, you may want to avoid that. Okay, so chapter 16. Just to recap where we are at in the previous chapter, Romand, Edge, and Raymir managed to fend off Kurok, the demonic wolf creature that was sent after them by Saltillion, but it did not stop Saltillion's pursuit. In the interim, Varasho has returned home, knows now that his father is in the dungeons of the palace and is plotting some type of rescue involving Lena Engrove, who is his brother Logan's former lover, which it is heavily implied is the reason Logan is currently not in Angladeus and was sent away, essentially to atone for indiscretions of that nature. So, 16 is, this is going to be a pretty single-minded chapter. This is all about Trem and the rest of the group. The faces of the people mulling about Delmore barely registered the incoming riders before they erupted in shrieks of terror. The citizens turned as one and fled, even as Logan attempted to calm them with shouts of "Peace, peace, we are but travelers passing through." None listened. The people of the town fled indoors, dropping all their possessions in the street as they ran. Logan continued to try to quell the panic, but Ghost roughly pushed by him, guiding his massive warhorse into the crammed streets. "Leave them, Knight. We move south. They'll know our intent when we're on our way." Logan shot a fierce glare at the grizzled soldier. "I'll be on my way when I know what has frightened these people so. There's a damned army of murderers bearing down on them, Algadaic. I'd say the cause of their fear is easy enough to determine. Then we ought to be staying to help, not passing them by in their hour of need." The two squared off, still arguing as the others squeezed through the western entrance, brushing up against the rough old wagons littering the road. Diaga shielded his eyes from the dust kicked up by the terrified townspeople and tried to take stock of the situation. Grimtooth was edging near his increasingly upset blood brother as he and Ghost continued exchanging choice words. Neep looked around bewilderedly, as did Gent, who stood beside her. Only Wrath seemed unshaken by the tattered appearance of what Diaga would later call a storm of human debris. Joven and Trem were bringing up the rear slowly. Trem led, but Joven was trying to sneak past him to see the condition of the dwellings beyond the wall. Trem opened his mouth, advising, "Stay behind me. We do not..." The town is dead. People still move about the buildings, but they're just shadows among the grave-like homes they've erected. Trem could not see them. They were all hiding. The road into town was cobblestone, very nicely made and unusual for a frontier town. These people had worked hard, and all they had raised was a carcass. There was still one person out there, at least, a hardened but unimposing man whittling beneath a great tree at the town's center. Trem needed supplies, and he would have to ask the only person who seemed willing to talk. He approached the figure as openly as he could so as not to startle him. Trem, are you okay?" What? Trem snapped out of his trance. Giovanna left his at his side, shaking him slightly. He looked very concerned. I said, are you okay? Trem shook his head and blinked a few times. Yes. Yes, I'm all right. It was just a hazy memory. Jovan stared hard at his friend in obvious concern and then released his shoulder without pursuing the bizarre instance further. Trem had frozen stock still and seemed to be staring off in the distance to the east, at something beyond even the horizon for several seconds, oblivious to the escalating turmoil around him. Logan and Ghost's argument had reached a boil inside the town walls, and the people were beginning to edge out of their homes, curiosity getting the better of their fear. At the front of those brave enough to venture back into the street came a slightly hunched older figure with a white-clad woman they'd seen from afar at his elbow. We're not here to aid farmers, Knight. We have a job to complete. Logan spun his horse and brought himself alongside the larger beast Ghost rode. You have your quest and I have my vows. I defend the defenseless, help those in danger, and I will know what is wrong in this town. Ghost's warhorse snapped at Logan's own steed, and the calmer mount cantered back a few steps. Ghost sneered cruelly as he replied, Even your horse knows better than you do. It seems Karok has as much distaste for you as I, Knight. There'll be no more of this. I'm in charge here. The elderly man wearing beaten leather armor carrying a worn bow stepped forward, his younger white-robed female companion remaining a bit behind him, and addressed Logan in a weathered voice. Are you truly a paladin of the Angledaic kingdom? Ghost turned on his daring townsman, growling through clenched teeth, Stay out of this, aged one. It's not your concern. Diaga intervened then, having circumvented the argument on a smaller horse, while Neep, Grimtooth, Gend, and Wrath watched from a small distance. The young mage was enraged at last, something none of the other companions had seen. So you have not changed, Greymane Squall. You remain a coward and a bully bent on his own personal gain. Ghost whirled on the mage and simultaneously drew his scimitar, holding it a short distance from the quietly mounted young man. That name is dead. Logan's eyes had gone wide. Greymane. Thane Greymane, the one who betrayed his own people to the Nerathian invaders, who let his family be murdered to protect his skin. Ghost rounded on his new accuser, shouting, They were to live. Our safe passage was to be exchanged for control of the city. Neep was already closing on the quarter Napoleon with her sword drawn. Ghost saw her moving and roared, Keep the cat away, mage, or I'll skin her alive. Diaga spoke calmly. She's wary of your blade being so close to my chest. It will be in your guts if she comes any closer. I think not. It was not Trem or Jovan who intervened then, nor any of the other travelers who had made the journey from Gailakill together, though they were all present. It was the old man who had spoken to Logan. His bow was drawn and pointed straight at Ghost's head. For all his years, the arrow never wavered from its target, and there was no tremor in his arm. His eyes glued to the stern face watching him along the notched shaft. Ghost slowly lowered his blade. The situation was far from diffused, however. The old man had relative control, but with the riled warrior staring down his arrow, he could not hold his weapon taut forever. Ghost attempted a disarming smile, but it was little more than a baring of teeth. The aged archer never took his eyes off him, and he addressed Logan. I wish to ask again, are you indeed an Angledaic paladin, young man? Logan paused a moment before replying, Not yet. My quest is to prove myself worthy of becoming one. And how would you do such a thing? Logan caught the look of the old man's eyes and saw the masked desperation in them. By helping those who need it. The stern elder relaxed his bow slightly and looked the young knight squarely in the eyes. I can think of a few people who might take you up on such an offer. No! Head spun as Trem let out a cry that sounded like a man having his very soul torn from his body. The old man also turned and he froze, his bow clattering to the ground when he saw who he had uttered such a terrible sound. He stared hard as Trem looked up at him in unspeakable confusion and horror. How can this be? Trem clutched at his saddle as he tried to maintain his balance. Not again. Not. The man beneath the tree was kind but firm. Trem could have no supplies. The people had barely enough to fend for themselves, let alone to share with a weary traveler. Trem sensed something was terribly wrong. Foolishly, he inquired as to what it was. The lone representative of the village was slow to tell him, but he relented before the intense eyes and strangely powerful demeanor of the young half-elf. The village was besieged. Only a week ago, a party of men had gone to the fields to recover the harvest for the month. Only one had returned, dying. He spoke of terrible monsters that looked like wolves but walked upright, and carried massive axes and spears. The young survivor told the townspeople these creatures had burned the fields and devoured his companions even as they lived. He said these abominations were coming for the town. The oldest among the people recognized the things of which he spoke as gnolls, an ancient plague on the peaceful people of the Dust Plains. Trem had digested this calmly without remark. The stern older man informed him they had expected the creatures sometime that night, and as they had been seen coming closer and closer each evening prior. Their shapes were massive and hulking in the dark, and there were many of them, far too many to stand against, yet there was nowhere to run. Against his better judgment, Trem sat and listened. Even more against his own good sense, he inquired as to plans for the town's defense, the numbers of able-bodied warriors, even as to who would lead them. They were questions that the seasoned man could not answer readily. He tried to organize resistance, as he alone had once been a soldier, but he made only small headway with those determined to resist. The people needed more than his voice to find their courage. Trem could feel the decision coming. He knew it was the wrong one. He knew he should just keep moving and find a way to get people out of this village safely on the road to a larger, better defended settlement. He knew he should wish the man well and encourage people to attempt a desperate, if impossible, flight under cover of darkness, perhaps going so far as to harass their enemies from a safe distance, to buy them time. Naturally, he did none of these things. Instead, he remained and began to conspire with the spokesman for the doomed hamlet. Trem snapped out of the trance once again. His head was spinning, and his horror was now beyond containment. Trem was shaking visibly in his saddle, and Jobin's steadying hands were the only things holding him atop his horse. The old man was moving closer to the stunned half-elf as though he himself could not believe it. But rather than horror, his face seemed lit up with a new sheen of hope. "It is you. You aided me and my friends, helped us once. You must do so again, Trem Waterhound. Please." The shock on the faces of those around him was the final straw. Trem threw his hands to his temples and cried out in a haggard, pained voice that none of his companions had heard before. "No, this is not happening. I will not." The thrashing hermit could not be contained even by the strength of his friend's firm hands. Trem hurled himself from his horse and smashed to the ground in a limp mound. Logan jumped down from his saddle and rushed to his prostrate form, soon followed by Diaga and Grimtooth. Ghost could only sit shocked in his saddle at this sudden turn of events. All he knew for certain was things were rapidly spiraling out of control. Javanaleth was on his knees beside his friend, trying to revive him. Logan appeared quickly at his side and helped turn the prone half-elf over. Trem's eyes were still open and his mouth was moving. Javanaleth leaned in, attempting to hear what his friend was saying. His eyes widened in horror as the words became clear. He turned to Logan with a mixture of fear and disbelief on his face. The knight grasped the younger man's shoulder, asking, "What is it, Jobin? What's he saying?" Jobin could not stop the descent of several tears as he listened to Trem's rambling. "Logan, God save us, Logan." "Jobin, what is it?" The young man turned back to his friend's shaking form, but he could not bring himself to repeat what he heard. Javanaleth motioned Logan closer, and the knight leaned in so he could hear the faint, strained voice of the half-elf. The young knight's face fell as he made out what Trem was muttering, and all he could say was, "Trem, my gods, Trem, what have you seen?" The man's name was Joseph, and despite himself, Trem felt a great deal of kinship towards him. He reminded the half-elf of his foster father. Maybe that was why he stayed in the town, even though every fiber of his being urged him to simply move on, or drive the residents to flee. Trem had learned quickly that whenever he stopped at somewhere for too long, he would wear out his welcome among the people. His elven heritage made him unpopular among most of the residents of the Dust Plains. In Mayana, the halflings had welcomed him, and in Gylakil he was just another half-elf passing through, but the farmers and settled people of the towns and villages often saw him as a threat. He'd come to this new village out of curiosity, as it had sprung up north of Mayana, seemingly overnight, based on rumors of iron deposits found in the nearby mountains. He'd meant to pass through, perhaps push westwards in search of aid, but Joseph had convinced him to stay. His stalwart calm and reserve, his seeming fearlessness of the terrible threat facing the village, Trem found that infectious. He listened as Joseph explained what the odds were. An entire pack of gnolls, he suspected perhaps 20 based on the account of the victim of the first assault, was intent on making the town a personal playground of slaughter. There were only 100 or so people in this fledgling hamlet, and many of the younger men had already met their fates at the hands of the gnolls while wandering outside the light of their new-built homes. Joseph brought Trem to the inn where most of the citizenry had barricaded themselves. There he introduced Trem to the people as warden of the plains, and Trem promised he would come up with a plan to defend the town. Trem had spent several years thanklessly patrolling the Dust Plains, defending the people from bandits and small groups of gnolls that threatened them. His swift legs and strong bow had helped him save many farms and merchants, but few were as pleased with their salvation when they met him up close. The forester elves of Silverleaf had long ago taught the people of the Dust Plains to fear their kind. Battles between elves and knights of Aves had left scars on the people here, and the resurgent Eagle Knights had spread their message of purity of human blood, leading to stronger animosity towards half-elves and other races. Trem had continued his quiet guardianship of the lands and their residents, but a growing anger at being mistrusted was simmering in him. Initially, that's why he had not planned to stay. It was a daunting task to face down even a few gnolls, and he believed that even successfully driving off a whole pack would do little to change the minds of the people here. But the older man had been convincing. Joseph himself was a former soldier. He'd fought in the battles against the Murkath goblins years before, and was calm in the face of such danger. Despite being human, Joseph did not care about Trem's mixed blood. He heard tales of the warden saving people on the plains, recognized Trem's huntsman attire, long heavy cloak and leather armor. All Joseph wanted was someone who was willing to help them. Though he had tried to change his ways in the face of the disgust and dismissal of many he had aided, Trem still harbored dreams of being seen as a hero. Joseph saw and fed into that desire in order to convince him to stay. The two toured the town as Joseph pointed out the many alleys and openings between the homes that the gnolls would use to infiltrate it. Gnolls had broad shoulders that might prevent them from using the narrowest of openings effectively, likely funneling them to the main street of the town. Trem concluded the best method of defense would be to gather around the great tree in the center of the village and await the attack. There were two main avenues in the northeast of the settlement, leading to the main road that would be easy paths for the gnolls to follow. Trem proposed setting up rickety barriers in each street, and when the creatures appeared, the defenders could rush to the appropriate spot to head them off. Ultimately, it might be enough to slow them or convince them that the attack was not worth the cost it could potentially incur. Joseph was hopeful they could buy time. Word had been sent southward and also to the north, where it had reached Trem and Mayana, so it soon would pass to Guilakill and perhaps the Eagle Knights would send a patrol to aid them. Trem agreed with the possibility, both men pointedly ignoring the rumors that Aves was dealing with threats from across the Syrian Sea that would pull their forces back to the fortress. In situations as dire as the one Joseph described, Trem knew that hope was an important factor for success. Trem knew Knowles had fought against them on a few occasions, and he thought he understood them. Knowles attacked without considering strategy. They overwhelmed through power and sheer ferocity of their assault. Monstrous creatures, they were strong and swift enough to overpower trained soldiers in great enough numbers. Joseph knew there were not enough townspeople experienced in combat to defend both roads, and feared that assuming the Knowles would attack from only one angle would leave them open to flanking. Trem insisted that if they did not defend one alley, they'd be forced to hole up in the inn, which would only lead to disaster. Joseph conceded that they set to building ramshackle barriers from furniture and scrap metal, using the benches from the inn to provide archers with a clean shot over the makeshift wall at their attackers. Trem discovered Joseph was not as old as he appeared. Years of campaigning in his younger days had given him a weathered and worn appearance, but he was barely 50. Despite years of fighting and injuries, Joseph still moved with the grace and power that Trem recognized as a great asset to their efforts. The older man's very presence seemed to lend courage to his fellows, and his vocal support of Trem was enough for the villagers to trust him. As they worked together, the two became almost symbiotic, the one knowing precisely what the other needed from him. Joseph and Trem were invigorating in their enthusiasm for the defense, and as they orchestrated the communal efforts, the people of the town slowly began to believe they might stand a chance. Joseph's primary concern was the safety of the women and children. He wanted to shield them from danger within the inn, but some of the women refused to stay out of the fighting. Those who would not stand down were armed as best they could be. The rest holed up in the barricaded structure with the children and elders. In case any of the Knowles slipped by the defenders, the gate innkeeper provided a heavy bell to be rung if the shelter group was in danger. By nightfall, the preparations, such as they were, had been completed, and the tiny detachment of combatants huddled around the great oak awaiting the monsters. As the darkness deepened, the tension rose, and much shifting and clattering was heard among the citizenry. Trem stood stock still, listening and straining to see in the inky blackness with his stronger elven vision. Joseph was leaning on his bow next to him, his eyes focused more on the defenders than potential assailants. As the hours passed, the older man relaxed slightly, turning to his companion. Perhaps they will not come this night. A spine-chilling howl came ripping out of the dark. Trem raised his bow and notched an arrow, but did not draw it. Joseph and the others followed suit as Trem gave instructions in a clear, calm voice. When they come, aim for the neck or the legs. Their chests are thick and bony, so a killing shot has to strike the neck. If you can't strike the neck, aim low. Their legs are long and weak. Hitting one will slow them considerably and buy us time. A young man next to Trem was shaking so badly his arrow was rattling against the wood of the bow. Trem paused his speech and grabbed the shaft of the arrow. If you're nervous, pick up a spear. An errant shot will help no one. As the youth complied, Trem took a step forward and continued speaking in an even voice. We'll use bows until I say otherwise. We must avoid close combat as long as we can. When it comes, we fight in shifts, half with bows and back, while the spears fend off the attack. Pausing, Trem turned to look his head over his shoulder. One last thing. They're large and fearsome creatures. You'll be afraid when they appear. Remember those you're fighting for. More howls came through the alleyways, but there was no way to tell which direction they were coming from. Joseph was on edge, fearing they would not see the Knowles until they were on top of them, and their carefully prepared strategy would prove useless. He was about to say something to Trem when the half-elf swung his bow upward and loosed a shaft into the leftmost street, though there was nothing in that direction the others could see. Even so, there was a cry of pain and rage. Trem's response was instantaneous. He rushed to the left barrier, shouting in earnest, "Fire away! Hold them off!" The townspeople were next to him in a heartbeat, firing arrows as quickly as they could. Many seemed to be flying wildly, but the barrage did not stop. There were more yelps of shock and rage, and now the defenders could hear the monsters running, their clawed paws scraping viciously on the cobblestones. Then a massive wolf-like creature burst into the torchlight, bleeding from several arrows that had found their mark. The effect on the men and women was terrible. They froze in place, and some cried out in horror. Even Joseph paused in shock, but Trem did not wait. The half-elf shot an arrow into the creature's throat, and it gurgled and sputtered as it collapsed to the ground. He readied another shaft. Do not stop firing. Fight. The defenders renewed their counterattack with vigor. More arrows flew faster and with greater accuracy into the now visible oncoming fiends. At first they all fell before reaching the barrier, but then a large contingent came rushing forward in a pack that the archers had difficulty thinning. Trem drew his long hunting knife and jumped over the barrier. Keep shooting, and stay on the wall. The half-elf met the three Knowles that reached the barrier calmly, blade held downward with his thumb on the pommel, positioned readily at his side. They came hurtling towards him recklessly, and Trem neatly swept between them, slicing effortlessly across the abdomens of the first two. They clutched at their bellies in pain and stumbled into the barrier as Trem whirled and thrust his blade into the back of the last monster's neck, causing it to rear upward in pain. Over the barrier, several spear tips thrust down to finish off the other gnolls. Trem hopped backward, away from the one he'd just stabbed, when Joseph shouted a warning from the wall. Trem turned just in time to see another pack charging forward. Without a clear way to get back over the wall, he motioned the others away from the barrier as he prepared to meet the new threat. Fighting retreat. Spears up. Trem managed to avoid the first two gnolls and wounded the third along its arm before the haft of a weapon struck him solidly in the chest, sending him flying through the air, clear of the makeshift fence, to land hard on the stones at the town center. Joseph was at his side in an instant, but Trem waved him away as he heaved himself to his feet. The villagers were faring badly, and more gnolls were coming into the light of the torches. Trem pushed Joseph forward. Help them, quickly. There are more than I ever expected, the older man sighed. More than we can handle. Trem rushed to assist the spearmen. Then we'll keep them away from the inn as long as we can. As the pack descended on the barrier, the townspeople, men and women, held forth their improvised weaponry and thrust it fearfully but aggressively at their enemies. The gnolls seemed to be all about them, but they could not penetrate the line of sharp weapons bristling before them. A few more arrows struck the congested mass of monsters, and though a few grasped spear shafts and pulled their wielders off balance or to a grisly fate as they came too close to the beasts, the assault was slowed and then halted altogether. Trem saw the despair of Joseph was misplaced and roared incoherently as he struck back with the people of the village, trying to break the assailant's spirit with a powerful counterattack. Trem watched as the lead gnoll, taking a spear in his chest, howled and spun away from the fight. Waving its massive axe in the direction of the darkness beyond the town, it began to retreat. The dozen or so creatures among the town fell back in as well, rushing back down the left road from which they had come. The villagers relaxed, but Trem jumped in front of them to wave them onward. Drive them out. Chase them clear of the light. We must make sure they know never to come back. The wounded hung back as the able-bodied men and women followed the half-elf down the dark street, firing arrows and yelling wildly. Trem was in the lead, his face beaming as the survivors about him cheered in celebration. A few clapped him on the shoulders in thanks, and despite himself he smiled at their gratitude. Joseph was by his side, laughing as the gnolls disappeared into the night. When their howls had quieted, he turned and clapped the half-elf on the back heartily. Trem smiled fully then, and the two stood arm in arm, tired but proud. The would-be warriors were sobering up as they recognized those among them who were missing, wounded or killed in the attack. Trem and Joseph made ready to lead them back to the town center. Then the bell of the inn began to ring in earnest. Trem's heart sank to the floor as the blood fled Joseph's face. The gnolls had deceived them. It had all been a diversion. Trem realized his gambit had gone terribly wrong. The half-elf raced down the street, the people of the town following him in a desperate sprint to reach the inn. Trem rounded the corner first, and his greatest fear was realized. There were over 20 gnolls crashing against the doors and windows of the building inside. Trem could hear the screams and cries of terrified people. As he rushed forward to attack the creatures, a shout went up behind him, and more screams, terrible cries of suffering and horror. Trem spun and saw even more gnolls, hidden in the street they had used to circumvent the defenders, tearing through the ranks of survivors like they were threshing wheat. Trem was caught in the center of the maelstrom, the beasts abandoning the attack on the inn to complete the destruction of the town's untrained militia. Trem held his ground, rage driving him as much as the guilt of his failure. He took several gnolls down before a spear drove into his shoulder, and he was tossed off the point like a rock from a sling. Trem crashed to the ground and could not rise. He waited there, blood seeping down his side, for one of the monsters to finish him off. But someone else found him first. Joseph had realized they had been duped once he saw the inn surrounded. Knowing he could do nothing but die with honor, he tried to fend off the beasts that had attacked the rear of the defenders. Then Joseph had seen Trem tossed through the air like a rag doll, and determined there and then that he would save at least one life that night. The gnolls had killed most of the fighting men and women, and their bloodlust now drew them to the inn. Joseph slipped behind the foul beasts into the shadows, and hurried to the beaten form on the ground. Trem was hurt and could not rise. The older man grabbed his cloak and dragged him behind a nearby house, hauling him into the darkness where they could hide. The half-elf struggled, assailing Joseph with demanding cries, "No, leave me, leave me." But Joseph would not listen. He pulled Trem into a small garden and laid him among the tall stalks of corn and wheat where they would not be seen. As best he could, Joseph staunched the bleeding with a cloth and forced liquid from his waterskin down Trem's throat. The half-elf fluttered in and out of consciousness, but when he was awake, all he could hear were the screams of the dying people in the inn as the gnolls tore them apart. Each time he awoke, he tried to rise, but Joseph held him down, refusing to let him throw his life away. Even though the true brutality of the slaughter was likely over in a matter of hours, it would be days and weeks on end that Trem would awake to the shrieks of children in unspeakable fear and pain, just before their unearthly cries were cruelly and abruptly silenced. Long after he wordlessly left Joseph, Trem had been haunted by visions of the deaths he had not seen, but heard so profoundly that their voices seemed to follow him everywhere he went since that cursed night. Trem's eyes suddenly regained focus as the words stopped spilling from his mouth. He could see Joven's blurred face before him, etched in fear and concern. Logan was just over his shoulder, a more knowing glint in his eyes. Trem realized he had been raving as he relived one of the most terrible nights of his life. That was the only way to describe it. He had not revisited it or recalled it. He had been there again. Suddenly he could not contain himself. With unnatural strength, Trem surged from the ground, throwing Javaneleth onto his back and causing Logan to stumble away from him. His soul burned with the pain of the vision as he searched for the man who knew too well what he had seen. Joseph's ancient eyes met his, and the onlookers could feel the crackle of electric recognition between them. Trem took a few steps near the old man, still not believing what he saw. Joseph was even more alarmed, for Trem was the same as he'd been when Joseph met him almost 25 years ago. Now a man of over 70 years, he was accustomed to, even comfortable with, the effect that age had on everyone, but this half-elf seemed untouched. No, that was not entirely true. His eyes appeared older than any Joseph had ever seen. Trem stopped a few feet from the old man who had once tried to help, and found he could not speak. Unimaginable horrors were still flitting through his mind. They had lain in the basement of one of the homes for weeks, Joseph sneaking upstairs to find food and gradually nursing Trem back to health. Trem had left as soon as he could stand, wandering aimlessly until he stumbled into Aves in service to the Eagle Knights. Every day he prayed something, anything, would erase that night from his mind, or snuff out his life altogether, and now it was here in the flesh before him, a living testament to his failure. The two men faced each other silently, but Joseph noted the strange quivering in Trem's body as he sought control over his memories and emotions. The old man approached and laid a hand on Trem's arm. Trem jerked away sharply, and his eyes burned into Joseph's. "Please," the old man whispered. "Please help me again." Trem met the worn man's gaze, and the conversation with Gerard Oakhart began to ring in his mind. There was a choice to be made here, and the choosing had terrible implications. Despite his fear, Trem felt the old desire to play a being hero rising from somewhere deep within, long suppressed inside of him. He began to feel a twinge of resolve, an intent to strive for action that was just and good, but then an image flashed harshly in the back of his mind. It was the body of a child, its sex indeterminable, with an arm chewed off at the elbow. Trem lurched backward, and with great effort forced himself to retain his standing position. It was not possible. He had tried to walk this mythical path of heroism before and knew it to be an illusion, a fable. He met Joseph's eyes again, as his own suddenly grew hard and unyielding. No. The old man felt as though he had aged another 50 years at the firm pronouncement from the one person he thought he could trust amid these travelers. His eyes sank, and Trem broke free of his stare long enough to wrench himself away. He turned his back on Joseph, on the town, and started walking south. Ghost, still mounted, spurred his horse forward and ripped the reins of Trem's own mount from Logan, who had been holding onto the riderless steeds. "Stay if you want, Agladaic, but it seems your friend knows better than you when the course of action is clear." Ghost wheeled away and brought Trem his horse. Logan looked on solemnly with his blood brother beside him. He cannot really mean to leave these people. Grimtooth placed a huge hand on his brother's mailed one. I'm afraid we were wrong, brother. Ine is the man we thought he was." Diago was calmly watching the procession as Gend passed him by. "Well, I suppose I ought to be going too, leading them on and such. Good luck, young mage. I hope you don't suffer too painful a death." Diago did not even glance at the halfling's extended hand, nor did he notice Wrath pass by and tug the little guide along with him. His eyes remained fixed on Trem's retreating back, as inwardly his mind raced. Trem and Joseph knew each other from before, long before. How was that possible? Neep sidled up to him in an attempt to comfort the puzzled youth, but Diago was trapped within his own mind, cycling over possible explanations. Only one person was not frozen to the spot by the sudden turn of events. Javaneleth of the Blade, prince of his people, seemed to have suddenly found himself. He rode forward and passed the departing travelers, stopping before the southern entrance to Delmore. Ghost smiled reassuringly, if not kindly, at him. "I see you too have come to your senses." Joven's glare would have knocked the old campaigner from his saddle had it been able. "Do not speak to me, traitor. I'd just as soon pretend we never met." Trem seemed to stop beside Ghost, but failed to meet the burning eyes of his young companion. Javaneleth pulled his horse closer and tried to move his face in line with Trem's. The half-elf finally managed to return the look, but Joven's stern grimace caught him off guard. "Come with us, Joven. This isn't our problem." Joven's eyes widened in fury. "Not our problem. There are innocent lives at stake here. Are you the same man who fed those refugees in Gailakill, or who nursed me back to health? What of your promise to aid me until we found my father? What happened to the man I started the journey with? What happened to my friend?" Trem's blank eyes looked back at Joven unblinkingly. "We were never friends, Javaneleth. I only made a promise out of the guilt I feel every day for the people I failed to help. You were just a way to ease my conscience. And now I realize that, after all I've seen, there is no conscience left in me. I can't be responsible for these people, or for you." Trem turned away and gently nudged his mount forward. "Goodbye, Joven of the Blade. I trust we'll not meet again in this world." The deserters moved on past the stunned Javaneleth and out of Delmore. As they passed, Joven found his vision increasingly blurred by tears seeping out of his eyes. He could only barely see the last figure that passed him, draped in black cloth. A soft whisper escaped the fabric. "Fear not, young warrior. His life will not last much longer than your own. And then they were gone. All right, so that is chapter 16, and I'll pick up with 17 and 18 tomorrow, unless there's a major time constraint. I'm planning on doing both of them. So I'm going to stop the recording, and I will get this uploaded to YouTube, hopefully either tonight or maybe tomorrow before we go to live reading. So I'll do Q&A stuff for people tomorrow if anybody puts some questions up. In the meantime, everybody should have a good start to their week. You can follow me on Twitter at Legacy Chronicle. You can also get the book available on Amazon. Just search T.H. Paul and Legacy Chronicle. It should pop right up. Both books are available in paperback and Kindle.